Welcome to the Root of It All, the State of Mental Health Conference of New Orleans Youth, hosted by the Institute of Women and Ethnic Studies, as well as Dillard University's Deep South Center for Environmental Justice. This event is funded in part by the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, the United States Department of Health and Human Services, Office of Adolescent Health, as well as the New Orleans Musicians Assistance Foundation GIG Fund. We are proud to host this event today here at Dillard University, which is designated as a historically Black college and university. HBCUs have a rich history and commitment to the advancement of minorities and playing an important role in the community. It is for those reasons that it is an honor for us to host this event here today. It is our hope that you will leave this conference today more informed and empowered to work with our community and our youth to better meet their needs.
Good morning. Good morning. After that last speech, I would just feel like I have to say, power to the people. All right. I got all fired up, you know? My attempt today is really just to place within the context of the disaster that occurred, how that in some way has affected or can affect the health of our youth, things that I've seen. I know that after Katrina losing everything, the death of my mother, before that, my brother 7 months later, and then Katrina, I was a basket case. Yes. And I'm a person who, I figure I'm pretty stable, but that was very, very difficult, even for me. I think my alcohol consumption went up quite a bit during that time, because we were reaching for a drink every time our nerves got bad. I was saying, God, am I going to become an alcoholic after this? And so you just can imagine it with the effect that it has on a stable adult, what kinds of impacts that could have on young children or adolescents. My presentation is really going to take you all the way back and try to set the stage for what we feel, and I say we, the people that I work with the research that we do, what we feel young people are being exposed to. And a lot of it centers around, in my opinion, justice. And the fact that we are not getting the kind of community response that we need to have for some of the issues affecting our children. But I believe that there's a reason for that. And that is that if you don't know, you can't do. And a lot of times, I have never found a community to make a wrong decision when they had information. Amen. When you don't know, you can't do. And a lot of what's happening to our children in this city is because we don't know. You know, and you start talking to a person and say, what? When did that happen? I didn't know that. We seem to have no structure for engaging the community to the extent that we need to be engaging them on all of these issues. Our center is a small center. We started out with maybe one idea of really dealing with environmental justice issues. It became a huge movement with hundreds of thousands of people engaged in this whole notion of that every person should have the right to clean air, clean water, you know, not to live near a toxic facility or just across the railroad tracks, as most minority communities could be identified. And there was a dump right next to that. All of that affecting our health. our emotional health as well. And so when I hear more and more about what's happening to our youth, you know, I'm saying, so where's the advocacy and activism around this? There's some, but it's tiny. And so that voice is not being heard. What's the process for making this a boom rather than a quiet noise by a few really dedicated people who fight with all the rest of us to get grant funds so that we can continue to do our work? Where is that? You know, what's the process for doing that? This is not what I'm supposed to be talking about, but I'm all of a sudden talking about this. But there is a process for getting these things done. And so the whole idea of community organizing, which some people poo-poo on, that's really very important. You know, I'm a researcher and a scholar to that extent. I write, I investigate, I bring people together. I train them to be advocates for themselves. We have to start training community people to advocate for themselves. Right. Because that's the strongest voice. Yeah. There are all these mothers who are going through these problems with their kids. We need to organize the mothers so that they then advocate for themselves. That's the best advocate you could find, a person who is directly affected. I know on a first-hand basis what it's like to have a mentally ill person in your family. I know what it's like to get the calls with them being out on the street, homeless, you know, not being able to get any help. Been dealing with it for over 10 years. There's no resolution yet. So I know personally the fear of that person being killed or calling the police and the police then kills that person. That fear. I know about that. You know, I know about it personally, so I can speak with passion about it because it's one of my family members that my family has been dealing with for at least 15 years without a resolution. And watching that person being somewhere in Texas, being put on a bus after Katrina, and we're told he's been picking him up at the Greyhound bus station. You know, they got rid of him in Texas and turned him over to the Louisiana mental health system. So I know about this person. There are some people who really don't believe that climate change exists. I don't believe any of those people are in this room if you went through Katrina. So there's really overwhelming evidence that climate change exists, and there's this very impressive international panel that has given us all the information that we need to know to verify that climate change actually exists. But these are some of the increased impacts that we can expect because of it. Increased flooding. We know about that. Higher mean atmospheric temperatures, higher global mean sea level, increased precipitation, increased droughts, increased atmospheric moisture holding capacity, increased heat waves, increased strength of storms, and it continues. More energetic waves, storm surges that reach further inland, undercapacity of urban sewerage and drainage systems, increased flooding, increased vulnerability of port cities, and disproportionate impacts on disadvantaged populations, something I also know about personally. So if we go back and look at the statistics, if you're still not convinced, if you look in 2005, that's when we had Katrina. It saw the worst Atlantic hurricane season since record keeping began in 1851. Don't have to go through what that was like. Most of us here lived through it. You move to 2010, and we had the third most active season in record. It was tied with 1887, 1995, and 2011. And we saw a lot of things moving forward. We began to see strange things like earthquakes in Haiti. We saw earthquakes in Chile. We saw flooding in France. And so 2011 was also tying at about third place for being the most active hurricane season. We moved to 2012 hurricane season, and what we're seeing is that we're on average to continue at about the same rate, but everything is increasing. And then we had Sandy, which surprised all of us. You know, a hurricane, where that happened, and a snowstorm sort of coming together. It was almost like that movie, The Day After Tomorrow, something like that. You get the feeling that things are really going downhill and fast. But you also began to see some things happening, although the faces were black or white or minority, you did see Staten Island, which was considered a poorer community. And so they were out screaming, you know, what about us? What about us? Everything's going over here, we're here. They had to make a lot of noise, and that was probably based more on class than race. But those things always come together. So Hurricane Sandy's impacts, 19 bodies were found in Staten Island. I dealt with Staten Island alone. The residents were outraged by what they described as a slow response. They should have been here for Katrina, right? Slow response, 2 weeks.
Yes, indeed.
Wow. Not saying that, that they should expect better response, but for those of us who lived through Katrina, it was almost laughable. You're like, what? They're there already? That's what I was saying. So this echoed the experience of residents of poor communities in New Orleans and the Gulf Coast after Hurricane Katrina. So managing weather impacts. Societies have always had to manage the impacts of weather and climate-related events. This isn't anything new. We've always had to do that. But the question always arises around equity. Disadvantaged populations around the world already bear inequitable environmental burdens, and there is inadequate knowledge of what new disproportionate impacts will emerge under climate change, a new normal where we find ourselves. But the differential effects of weather disasters, we know a little bit about that, because what we know is that low-income people who already suffer at a higher rate from socioeconomic stresses and toxic burdens really find this situation being exacerbated after a particular storm, and such was the case in the city of New Orleans. It was largely African Americans and often poor populations that lived in areas most vulnerable to the collapse of the levees that were unable to secure transportation. We all remember the buses underwater for evacuation and who scrambled in frightening conditions to secure scarce resources and aid for their families and themselves. And so these are just some pictures just to remind you of exactly who was most affected. It was mostly women and children and minorities. The pain is pretty evident in most of the situations where some people found their family members dying, and elderly people who would leave their pets, stuck, and young people. Grief is just evident all around you. Here's the elderly and children. And this looks like a third world country. This particular picture always amazes me. It looks like some people running from rebels. You know, like there's a big war or something someplace and they're trying to get out. These are actually New Orleanians after Katrina. And of course you had the children who were evacuated out via helicopter without their parents. And people who actually had to endure the death of family members with nowhere to put them. And this is what the scene was when they were leaving in buses. Katrina, it becomes a case study when you look at inequities. Who recovers? That becomes the big question. And there was a study that was done in 2008, and it actually showed that white people recovered and black people didn't. The statistics were basically that 80% of white people who were affected by the storm recovered and 80% of black people affected did not. So it was actually the reverse in a city that was predominantly African American, and studies hold that out. And so when we were talking about consequences, policy decisions that are made that actually affect us, this is real. And we have to start educating our community about how to get involved in setting policy. It's easier to get something done before a particular policy is put in place. Once it's there, the fight is to remove it. But when you become the advocate of a policy and you get that policy put in place, it's a hard fight, but it's easier than one where you're rolling something back. Our communities need to understand that process. But here are some of the perilous consequences of policy decisions after Katrina. The building plan. I called it disaster capitalism, just cowboy capitalism. It was just going really crazy. And when I saw this map, I knew for certain because they had a green spot over where I lived. It's like, who the hell did this? You know, who decided that my neighborhood was going to be a green space? We got lots of green spaces in the east. One of the largest parks in the city. We have all kinds, but somebody decided, no, this is how we're going to replan this city, as if nobody ever lived here before. Like they had a clean sheet of paper, we're going to move forward. Well, that was I called it the big land grab. And when you looked at this map, now this map may have made sense to some people, but it made no sense to me. They called it neighborhood rebuilding, immediate opportunity areas. But all of the immediate opportunity areas were places that didn't get water. Or there were places that only got a little bit water. So all the money that was coming in was not to help the people who lost their property, but to help build an area that wasn't touched. And they said, oh, this is easy. We'll take all this money. We'll build up, what, the Garden District, the Central Business District, CBD. And we're all sitting out in the east, lower ninth ward, Gentilly, trying to figure out how we're going to get back home. That was the plan. Now that might make sense to who? Developers? Sense to some people with political reasons for trying to make certain we don't get back here? Might. Maybe you could change the city council. It's no longer majority black. It might become majority white if we stop these black people from coming back, right? That's a possibility. Or is it reality? So you see the unwritten plan. If you want to see a plan, because what happened was the community came out in droves and we said, oh, this is not happening. So they backed off, right? So it was mostly African Americans and Vietnamese that was in all these meetings yelling, no, we're coming back, you're not taking our land. We noticed that people backed off, but you know, if you want to see the real plan, you should just follow the money. That generally tells you where the plan is. So we conducted a study, we did a GIS analysis, and I need to say this, I need to make this clear. This was under the previous administration. We don't have the numbers yet for the present administration, but we're talking about just at the end. So, you know, it takes a while for you to get the data, and sometimes you can't get the data, but we were able to get this data right after the storm. You remember all of those meetings people in New Orleans went to, the design meetings, the charrettes, and, you know, I mean, we went to so many of them. I think New Orleans community people are the best educated planners, city planners in any place in the country because we went to so many of these meetings. And so at those meetings, people made decisions about how they wanted to see their community rebuilt. And then they put priority scores, like we want money to go here first. And in that list, this is last. They had prioritized what they wanted. How did that work out when you looked at the money? Well, I'll show you how it worked out. All of that planning, believe it or not, this is what we got. Now you should look at this. Did we bring handouts?
Please.
Someone was supposed to bring handouts. Did he come? I wanted to bring handouts because it's really important to look at this. You look at these district planning maps and you look at the numbers. I thought you would have it in your hand so that you could see. But when you go to the next map, this shows you where the money went. And the money went largely to section 1 and 2, which was Garden District and CBD.
Yes, indeed.
Central Business District. That's where the majority of the money went. If you look at spending, what was actually allocated. Then if you look at poverty maps, you actually, when you put them together, you can actually see that the poorest areas got the least amount of money, even if they were affected by water. But this was a killer to me. Now you look at this map, it looks pretty good. You're looking at how much money African Americans got and how much money planning districts. Because we're so segregated here, you see we can do it by race. So there's what we call racialized space that absolutely exists in this city. So you look at African Americans in yellow and whites in red, and you see that we didn't fare out too bad. We're just a little bit less than what white people got, right? Just a little bit less. But when you look at it, there are 4 white majority planning districts and there are 8 black majority planning districts. So 4 planning districts got more money than 8 planning districts based on race. Now, for most of you sitting here, this is not a surprise. You really just go uptown. It's booming up there.
That's right.
They got white kids on bicycles.
Right.
They're on skateboards all through the neighborhood all night. It's just a happy place. I live in the East. We got one supermarket for 70,000 people. One supermarket.
None in the night.
Oh, and I'm still mad as hell at this. I still get upset when I think about it. Most of us don't know how things have been moving because there's no big policy research center here that looks clearly at the data and give communities the information they need. We don't have that. And those of us who try to get it, try to do it on a shoestring. We don't have the money to do it, but we do it anyway. In little small pieces, dribbles. That's how it comes out. We don't have the funding of foundations to do this kind of thing. We don't. You go to California, New York, oh God, they have all kinds of money that goes into research and policy centers. And they watch every penny. They watch every penny. And they make certain that the young boys that you were talking about are taken care of. They make certain that young children with lead poisoning get taken care of. They look at small businesses that pollute areas, and they map it and graph it, and they get a policy change because of it. We don't get anything here because we don't know, so we can't do. And as long as they stop us from getting the information we need, we cannot protect our children. And I'm getting a little bit, bring it down. Just a little bit, getting a little bit too excited here. And then I use examples of putting those dollars and the way they've been allocated into real life situations. We can look at inequities, unequal protection and unequal treatment of African Americans over decades in New Orleans are factors that have made them more vulnerable to devastating impacts of a disaster. These factors include physical location, socioeconomic status, and race. And so lingering institutional constraints created and perpetuated by racialized place have hindered progress towards equitable recovery. That's in my new book, by the way. So inequitable housing, this is one of the first, I'm going to do this quick, but you know about the Road Home program where we were fighting inequities. We always knew this, but we didn't know it would affect us like this. That my house in New Orleans East on a man-made lake is probably worth less than some house in Metairie jammed up right next door to something else, you know, with not enough space. But that house is worth more money. Why is it? Because I live in a black neighborhood and they live in a white neighborhood. It's just vestiges of segregation and racism. So our houses are not even valued the same. So this had an unbelievable impact after the storm. Because if they valued your house at pre-storm values, you didn't even have enough money to fix your house. But a white person in Metairie with a much smaller house, not as nice, got more money because the value of their house was higher. So they were sued. It was a battle, but I'm going to go to the end because it actually turns out that once there was a settlement, over $400-some million went to homeowners so that they got more money for their house. But this should be inequities in public housing. Like, we look at the public housing, it looks so nice everywhere. I'm like, wow, you look like, boy, this is just great. I mean, boy, we got the blight out of the way, and we have all of these beautiful apartments now, rather than public housing. But there were some things that were happening here. There used to be the law that said for public or affordable housing, there had to be a one-to-one replacement. So if that goes away, you can reduce the number of units available, and that has caused for us an affordable housing shortage. So now there's approximately 20,000 families on the waiting list for Section 8 vouchers. That's not counting the people still in Baton Rouge trying to come home.
Mm-hmm.
The kids in Baton Rouge who want to come back and go to school, but they can't get into any school here, so they have to stay in Baton Rouge. There are all kinds of ways of depopulating a community, and it has everything to do with policy. So we're watching this happen, where Hano currently serves 17,000 families, and we got 20,000 on the waiting list. the Road Home update, I've already told you that we won, well, didn't win, but there was a settlement. There were inequities in infrastructure right after the storm. It was really funny to me. After the storm, well, before the storm, New Orleans was known for its park system. We had one of the best in the country. The reason being, separate but equal. People wondered why we had such a good park system. It was all about separate but equal. It was to make certain that you didn't come to their parks. So the parks in the black neighborhoods were sometimes better than the parks in the white neighborhoods. It was all about separate but equal. Then separate but equal went away and the system stayed in place. You need to know history to understand why these things happen. It wasn't just because they wanted us to have better parks than white people. It was to make sure we didn't go to theirs. And after the storm, what we found was that parks were being repaired. But the ones that were being repaired were ones that were hardly affected by the storm. You had these new public-private partnerships. But the private side were very careful about what public side they decided to connect with to fix the parks. That has been improved now. But in the beginning, it was only, and so you saw the difference in the parks, uptown versus everywhere else in the city where black children played. We have a wonderful history from Progress to Terrible. The Times-Picayune did a very good job of showing how, looking at the parks and showing how bad they were, and really dealing with the history of how good they used to be. So we went from progressive to terrible. Public education, we all know the story about what happened with the public school system, how our public school teachers were all fired. A lot of people don't know about the injustice that actually occurred for New Orleans public school teachers. And the suit that's in place now is really about monies that were put there to pay teachers while they were trying to come back, and the teachers in Jefferson were paid, and the teachers in St. Bernard Parish were paid. The only teachers who weren't paid were the teachers in the city of New Orleans. If you don't know, you can't do it. So a lot of that's going on now with that suit. We believe they're going to win. Have you seen the test scores? Have you seen the test scores? I don't see much difference, but I see a whole lot of money going, and I see a lot of public property being turned over. That's what I see. If you don't know, you can't do. If you don't know, you can't do, and we need to do better at knowing. Food security, I've already talked about that. And I'm going to conclude now. I'm almost out of breath. Katrina raised a new class of problems that demand rigorous analysis, prudent planning, and courageous political leadership. At stake are the lives and futures of our most precious commodity, our children. Thank you.